So when Anna approached me and asked for a title, sort of set a challenge, it landed on transformative knowledge, experimentation, contestation, and deliberation and innovation. But as we all know, challenges are not linear sort of processes, so things have changed along the way. So I'd rather, I would say I changed the title and the topic a bit, because I think the red line throughout my research over the past years has been geography. So from focusing a lot on geography innovation, I've started to become increasingly interested in geography of transitions. So I thought, oh, that title actually doesn't really have any geography in it. So I think I'll speak more about what makes regions conducive for experimentation, contestation, and deliberation in transformation processes. And it'll allow me to theoretically reflect a bit on work that I've been doing in Sweden and Australia primarily, and maybe a little bit on what's happening in Norway. It's probably a sort of an important caveat also that a lot of that work was, in a sense, policy research, not necessarily policy evaluation, but it was research on policy initiatives and policy programs. So it started already back in the days in Lund, where we did some research on a regional innovation strategy initiative program around biorefineries of the future in northern Sweden, which kind of manifested itself in a demonstration site, which can be conceptualized as an experimentation. Then working a couple of years in Melbourne with the local council and being kind of entangled in the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities initiative. I looked at the implementation of that strategy, and it was, to me, a typical case of a strategy that was implemented through innovation. So the way that Melbourne wanted to improve its resilience was through a portfolio of innovation projects. You could say that was sort of governing through experimentation, in the words of Harriet Balky and Vanessa Casambroto. On the back of that, I also did a bit of work on designing and implementing a regional innovation strategy, a smart specialization strategy, if you like, in a coal region in Victoria, close to, in sort of regional Victoria, close to Melbourne, in Gippsland, where the time when I arrived, that region started to face the effects of decommissioning coal-fired power stations and coal mines. And most recently, I've also been involved in, again, a policy initiative in Sweden, a so-called Strategic Innovation Program around viable cities, which sets itself the mission to have climate-neutral cities by 2030. And a whole range of cities in Sweden are involved in that program. And again, a lot of emphasis is on implementing that objective through innovation projects. And knowing myself a bit too much, I think I'll start with the conclusion. So we've got that covered, and then we'll try to kind of argue my way towards that. So I think what I'm a bit sort of concerned with, and what I find very interesting, is how we are increasingly also observing polarization around transformative change. And that's, I think, very well illustrated by demonstrations now, sort of as a consequence of climate policies. The green vests in the yellow vest in France, and at the same time, Extinction Rebellion. And it kind of creates a bit of a conundrum. Everyone's sort of for innovation, but there's way more resistance against transformation or change, maybe even. So innovation is supposed to solve existential challenges. If we kind of increase the level of ambition that we expect from innovation, from growth and competitiveness agendas, to basically sort of solving global problems and potentially existential problems, But as a result of that sort of higher level of ambition, those innovations and solutions are also becoming increasingly contested. And I would sort of argue and conclude that the proposition of local experimentation is that it can turn contestation around innovation into a productive force that counters polarization and facilitates deliberation. So contestation in by itself is perhaps a good thing, but then it's the way how we deal with that and how we also are able to integrate that into innovation processes and thinking about innovation. And I think still the question remains how to organize and design such processes. We can have a discussion perhaps on that. So I think this talk also partly relates to what we've been talking about yesterday. Obviously, Kastien's very nice presentation about living labs speaks very much to the theme of experimentation. Ben, your intervention around is it really a matter of knowledge and how we sort of should think about knowledge in terms of, what is transformative knowledge? And I very much like this idea that knowledge is, provides an ability to act. And I think that also plays out in the whole sort of thinking around experimentation. And similarly, the discussions we had about lay knowledge is I think, playing in here when we start talking about living labs and experiments. So first I wanted to sort of situate this discussion a bit into sort of a turn to transformation, a turn to challenge-driven innovation, to missions, what you could broadly call a normative turn in innovation studies and innovation policy. Then spend some time reconceptualizing innovation as experimentation, and that's sort of also how I would like to sort of insert thinking around, what's the matter of knowledge here, innovation and experimentation are knowledge-based activities. And then some thoughts around how to organize for experimentation, contestation, and deliberation, and drawing on some of the insights a bit anecdotally from practice, from the empirics. So I got a lot of inspiration from your presentation in Ljubljana, where you kind of situate also this network in sort of this transition from thinking about knowledge-intensive regions to transformative knowledge regions. And it very much sort of resonates with the turn towards missions to challenge-driven innovation policy, et cetera, et cetera. So what is really happening there is that knowledge is being conceived less as a place-based asset in economic processes and more as a solution to additional goals. And largely that's within the social and environmental domain. And climate change is, of course, probably the most pressing one. And that's, that resonates with the whole turn to missions, following the word Mazzucato and being readily adopted at all levels of policy making, but also how smart specialization strategies now start to turn towards, the SDGs. So we see all of that happening. While we see that sort of shift in objectives and goals, we also, I think, can witness a more capacious understanding of what are the innovations that are needed to achieve, to address those goals. So beyond sort of market-based or market-oriented and technological innovations, increasingly focusing also on social innovation, grassroots innovation, innovation in the public sector, and also in that sense sort of shifting the focus from a sort of an instrumental value of innovation to intrinsic values of innovation. So what does the improved product process actually do in terms of problem solving? And finally, I think we see a turn in greater reflexivity about innovation and its outcomes and impacts in sort of the policy discourse, notably through the notion of responsible research innovation, RRI, and a greater awareness that it's not all innovation hallelujah, but there are often unintended consequences, noxious effects of innovation, as Elisa Giuliani calls them, And again, I think there's a greater awareness that we need to sort of think about those unintended consequences, those potentially negative consequences of innovation, and think about what does that mean for how we govern innovation. So, reading a lot of transitions literature, I think the emphasis there on experimentation is a sort of a useful conceptual inroad to think more broadly about innovation in the context of transformative knowledge regions. And I mean, you see the term experimentation also sort of popping up in various different sort of literature. So already mentioned, of course, within the MLP model, it's very prominent. Within transition management, it's sort of a key inroad. But also, Marianne Mazzucato's work on missions talks about the portfolio of projects and bottom-up experimentation that is needed to achieve missions. Even though she's a bit less clear about what she really means with experimentation. So I stick in a sense to the transition literature, and I think there was a nice literature review by Frans Sengers and Hopp and Anna Wiczeret, 2019, where they defined then experimentation as an inclusive, practice-based and challenge-led initiative designed to promote system innovation or transition or transformation through social learning under conditions of uncertainty and ambiguity. So, I mean, there's a lot of sort of differences also there in terms of how we define normally innovation. There's a greater emphasis on inclusion. There's a greater emphasis on practice-based, which kind of opens up the sort of the sorts of innovations you can consider. There's an explicit sort of purposefulness around it, geared to challenges, and so on. So what would be then sort of common features of experimentation? And it would have been easy to sort of stay within the urban realm, but also especially given that yesterday we were at a steel plant. I did also put in the case that we worked on with the biorefinery in Sweden, because that's also, as you see, a massive sort of industrial site with a lot of materiality and a lot of sunk costs. But still, where interestingly, that sort of initiative was really sort of framed around a demonstration project, and where also a lot of experimentation happened. So to first of all take that feature of experimentation is multifaceted. While they were doing a lot of R&D projects in that biorefinery, with all the constraints that you don't sort of do a quick sort of pop-up innovation in a large industrial site. But while they were doing that, sort of small-scale pilot projects, technological projects around biorefining, at the same time there was a sort of a platform and deliberation around sort of what are then sort of the social economic sort of barriers, implications of biorefining, and sort of the initiative, sort of in addition to doing a lot of sort of interesting technological innovation, also kind of adds sort of solutions, suggestions for institutional change that would be required to make bioproducts, bioenergy become sort of viable. But equally, it kind of induced companies involved in the initiative to start testing with different and alternative business models, which again was very difficult in the sort of industrial setting of large companies and so on. But I thought that was an interesting sort of perhaps unintended consequence of what was primarily framed initially as sort of a technological project. I think we discussed that already yesterday a lot. Experimentation tends to be always situated. It's always in a real place. It's always localized. But then experimentation to me also means that it's open-ended. It is really sort of testing with uncertain outcomes. So that sort of then also presupposes that a lot of experiments will not become successful, right? But it's really sort of an open-ended learning process. Then it's a lot about also contestation. I mean, I think there are the examples around urban experiments are very illustrative. I mean, we have the driverless vehicles. We know that that's a very contested topic, a very contested innovation or experiment, especially when people get killed by driverless vehicles. Then it creates a lot of protests also. But also something very mundane like bicycling or active transport is a very contested issue in a place like Melbourne, which is a very car-dependent city, and where the local council's sort of initiative to ramp up sort of a bicycling infrastructure, which was part of the Resilient Melbourne strategy, created a lot of protests. A lot of car drivers found it deeply unsafe that local council was investing that heavily into bicycle infrastructure. So being on a bike in Melbourne is a sort of very contested experiment. Similarly, the experiments around nature-based solutions, urban forest, less contested as bicycling, but also there, that sort of experiment or that innovation, again, pushed by local council, created also a lot of pushback and people complaining about, you know, I get a lot more sort of rodents in my street, which I don't particularly like, and etc. etc. So again, there was a lot of testing and trialing and unexpected sort of consequences as a result of these innovation experiments. And then a very important and potentially more sort of challenging common feature of experimentation is it's very ephemeral. And there's again a bit of a conundrum there, especially how the literature very much emphasizes experimentation as sort of the solution or the mechanism to address transformative big change. Something very light is supposed to create structural fundamental changes. Because experiments are short-lived, they're running a couple of years, often, you know, not with a great deal of funding. And I think there's an interesting paradox there between that ephemerality and the ambitions and aspirations that are sort of projected on experiments. And then some of the, I think, the key challenges in experimentation. I think the overarching sort of challenges, you know, will boats lift the tides? Sort of the boats, or the experiments being the boats, and the tide being the transformative change. So first of all, and we had a bit of that discussion already yesterday, the way that a lot of those experiments are being delivered is through projects. And there's a kind of a critical literature on projects around projectification, which also sort of asks attention for sort of the limitations, the risks that follow from organizing through projects, because it very much emphasizes delivery and implementation. It emphasizes strict, you know, the project form emphasizes strict monitoring of quantifiable outputs, and the expectation of efficient operation in a controllable and cost-efficient manner, right? So yesterday we talked already about that once sort of experiments get sort of piloted as projects, the stakeholders or the people responsible, the project managers, need to start sort of securing funding, and they become very preoccupied with, you know, how do we continue with our project, right? That's why I'm a bit critical of the discussion around scaling, because it is very much sort of limiting sort of the experiment as a project. And in relation to that, perhaps also a lot of those experiments then become framed in a quite boosterist, heroic kind of ways, right? Again, like with the Resilient Melbourne strategy, in innovation challenges around digital solutions like platform technologies, but also bicycles, are supposed to solve really wicked sustainability problems around transport, and where perhaps an alternative topic, what to do with public transport, remains untouched. And sort of at the same time, then sort of those sort of small scale interventions may lead to unambitious incrementalism, where because of the way it's being organized as a project, it is more about what is achievable rather than what is necessary, right? What can we achieve within the scope of our experiment rather than what should we, what should be done in the view of the transformation or transition that we are aiming at. And in doing so, then sort of reproducing rather than challenging knowledge systems and relations, and thus sustaining the status quo. I think that's very nicely described in a paper by Westman and Castambroto in Antipode. They call it the Ivy discourse around transformative change, urban transformative change. Something that's being picked up right now a lot in the literature on STS by people like Bodenhauer is sort of this turn to solutionism. Again, something we discussed yesterday. Rather that it is about sort of solutions that are looking for a problem, right? So a lot of the problem framings get sort of framed in sort of response to readily available and often technological sort of solutions or fixes. And again, that kind of narrows down the framing quite a lot, and also who would be sort of the relevant stakeholders, etc., etc. And a fourth sort of reflection or challenge that's coming a lot out of, I think, more critical work on living labs is that they also open up for organized irresponsibility, a bit borrowing the word of the term of Louis Beck, and ending up in situations where actors experiment and learn in an open-ended manner in the experiment, but where no one is really held accountable or responsible for the outcome and continuity of the efforts. I mean, it's typically a multi-stakeholder space. It's typically, a governance space, and it's unclear sort of who really should be held accountable for whether that that experiment is succeeding, whether it's a good sort of investment of public funding, etc. So it's a bit of a word of caution. I mean, there's a lot of optimism in sort of turning to experimentation, and in that sense, sort of, it's a lineage from innovation studies about, we need to think about solutions rather than about problems. But there's also a risk that, just like innovation, also experiments and experimentations become a slogan, and that it creates ceremonial policy responses, hand-waving rather than effective action. So I think, an important area, I think, for future research is to better understand the meta-governance of experimentalism. I think there's a lot of focus on sort of what is happening within the experiments, sort of the inside-out perspective, and there's less attention for an outside-in perspective, sort of in what institutional setting or configuration do these experiments really happen. And Johannes and I had an interesting discussion about that on the way here. And we've tried to sort of start thinking about meta-governance a bit in a paper where we also looked on the resilient Melbourne strategy with Sebastian Fastenblatt, where we were inspired by work from organizational studies on sort of pragmatism approaches to grand challenges. A paper by Ferraro et al., where they sort of they suggest three sort of design principles for how to govern solutions for grand challenges, where distributed experimentation is one ingredient, but they also call attention for a participatory architecture, right? The whole thing around inclusion, which stakeholders to include and what to expect from them and what resources to allocate there. And what they call multivocal inscription. It's a lot about working with boundary objects, and where both sort of the challenges can be boundary objects, right? Resilient Melbourne, what is that really? Again, many stakeholders would have different interpretations of that, but they probably have sort of a common core as well. But also where the solutions are kind of boundary objects. And that kind of goes a little bit to the point about contestation around innovation. And that's, I think, also resonates a bit with the work coming out of Utrecht by Koen Franken and Iris Wanzenbuck, where they look at mission-oriented innovation policy as sort of a problem-solution space and framing that as wicked problems. So I think it would be interesting and important to flip the perspective a bit and start asking questions about what's really being tested. Is it the technology? Is it the innovation that's being tested? Or is it the social order, the institutional context that's being tested? And then I'll start asking questions about what really defines the success and failure of experiments, and who defines success and failure of experiments. And if you ask that, you can start to think about what are the institutional logics that prevail in those experiments or in those innovations. Is it a corporate logic, or is it an administrative logic? Because you also see that, demonstration projects, experiments, they do get orchestrated by different types of actors. You have experimentations that are being led by and orchestrated by big corporates in the smart city space, by state actors, but also by NGOs. So there's a wide range of different modes of orchestration in experiments. But what happens in terms of mainstreaming about learning of lessons from the fuck-ups of the experiment? So to conclude then, coming back to the question that I asked, why are regions conducive sites for experimentation, contestation, and deliberation and transformative processes? I mean, this is still quite preliminary and quite anecdotal, but I mean, looking across the different instances over the years, the local scale, and I'm sort of putting regions and urban sort of together. The local scale provides this kind of safe space to experiment, innovate, to be involved in unruly processes, but where also activities like contestation and deliberation are examples of unruly processes, and where it's important that different stakeholders can have a frank, honest discussion with each other, and that requires trust. So yeah, a lot of that, of the learnings from experiments would be learning from failure. And I think there is a sort of a proximity premium to that, to learn from failure. But I also think there's potential to redress the projectified governance of experimentation. Because at the sort of the local scale, I think there's leverage potential to anchor, mainstream, and translate experiments. So again, taking the example from Melbourne, there was scope. It was limited, but there was scope that these experiments also sort of fed into the traditional mandates, capabilities, and resources, planning resources of the city of Melbourne. And that's sort of because on the sort of the local scale, you would find an entanglement of the sort of the temporary organization of experiments and permanent organizations. Or, then recently argued in the paper, there's an entanglement of hard and soft spaces of governance, right? Sort of the experiments themselves are typical instances of soft governance, but they are also sort of related to sort of formal administrative configurations of governance. And that lends them also a lot of sort of democratic sort of legitimacy. So I think there is an important sort of aspect to consider when we start thinking about, mainstreaming and translating experiments and getting sort of legitimation for the changes that are being suggested through experiments. And then I think finally an important aspect of experimentation is diagnostic, not conventional monitoring, or formative evaluation, not summative evaluation, not just sort of finding metrics to assess whether a goal is being achieved, right? How many startups did you create? How many innovations or patents did you take? But rather adding the question, and why, right? That's what is diagnostic about the monitoring. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope there's plenty of time for discussion, and yeah, thank you.